if you're making a claim, if you're expecting others to accept your point of view or the case that you're laying out, then you should know that you have the burden of proof. In Latin, that's known as the onus probandi, and it's yours. It's your obligation to prove the claims that you're making. I'll talk about what it means to prove something in just a moment, but before we go there, let me take a little tangent. This is happening a lot in the mainstream. And so I want to point out that it's a logical fallacy. It's lazy thinking. It's incorrect if you believe that it's the other party's responsibility to disprove what you've asserted. That's not accurate. You have the burden of proof to prove it. They do not have the burden of proof to disprove it. Here's an example. Let's say that I claim you are a thief. Now, because I've made that claim, it's my responsibility to prove it. It's not your responsibility to disprove it, even though you might be really, really motivated and eager to do so. Whether it would be in a court of law or in a general forum, this is just the way things work. And it's a good thing, too, because otherwise we'd all be making ridiculous false accusations and malicious claims against each other. We could claim any absurdity we want to as the truth. Imagine if I could say to you, there are herds of purple and yellow giraffes on Saturn. Well, you'd expect me to prove that. Otherwise, you wouldn't believe it. But if things were turned around, you would have to disprove it. Otherwise, it would stand as fact. And because you can't disprove it, I could pretty much claim anything I want to. I could let my imagination run wild with all sorts of ridiculous claims. And since you couldn't disprove them, and no one could, we'd be accepting absurdities as truth. But our inability to disprove something doesn't make it true. Because it's virtually impossible to disprove something, even when it isn't true, that's just not the way things work. Although you've never, ever stolen anything, how could you possibly prove that? You can't. And that's why the burden of proof is mine. Now, when I say burden of proof, actually there are three different levels of burden of proof, three different standards. Let me start with the weakest one. That's known as a preponderance of evidence. And basically that means that an incident or a claim is more likely than it is unlikely. An incident is more likely to have occurred based on what we can see than to not have occurred. There's a 51% greater likelihood that what I say is true than there is that it's untrue. But it's a very, very weak standard. It's usually not enough when it comes to a court of law or to people believing in something that's been said. The next level of burden of proof is to offer clear and convincing evidence. And this is where your facts and the information that you provide, they are substantially more likely to be true than what the opposing party is presenting. There's a high probability of truth in the case that you make, based on facts, based on reason. The standard that we use in criminal courts here in the US, the highest standard of a burden of proof, is beyond a reasonable doubt. That means the only logical explanation is the one that's been derived from the facts offered and those conclusions that have been drawn. There isn't any other reasonable theory that would explain the situation. The burden of proof at all three of those levels relies on credible evidence. Proof is made up of facts and credible evidence. Undisputed facts, they're not opinions. And then testimony that's worthy of belief and of consideration. Juries are asked to evaluate evidence and to make sure that it's natural, reasonable, and probable in order for it to be credible. And we should do the same. When we have the burden of proof, we want to make sure that what we are backing our claims up with is factual and highly probable and beyond a reasonable doubt. Otherwise, we haven't really exercised all our critical thinking faculties, and we're not demonstrating our mental might. Instead, we're relying on some lazy thinking that doesn't serve us very well.